Hello and welcome to this webinar looking at the impact of steer tracking. We're just going to wait for a couple of minutes for people to enter the webinar and then we'll make a start. So bear with us for a few seconds and we'll be with you in a moment. For those of you just joining, we're just waiting for the other people to enter the webinar, and then when they are, we'll make a start. Okay, so I think we'll start again now. So thank you very much indeed for joining this morning, and as I say, a very warm welcome to this webinar on the impact of steer tracking. And it's my great pleasure to introduce two members of staff from St Lawrence College in Ramsgate, Tom Moulton, the Deputy Head Pastoral, and Amy Humphries, the Housemistress and Steer Tracking Lead at Lawrence College. Founded in 1879, it provides an education for around 640 students aged right down from 3 up to 18, and is particularly well known for its pastoral care and placing a very strong emphasis on mental well-being. They are currently in their 4th year of using steer and are one of our accredited schools, demonstrating a use of the data across the school and embedding it in their day-to-day practices. So thank you very much indeed, Tom and Amy, for joining us this morning. Just before we sort of get into the steer section, could you just tell us a little bit about the pastoral care at St Lawrence's?
Yeah, the pastoral care at the school, I suppose, in many ways would be similar to a lot of independent schools insofar as we have a house system. So every pupil is under the care of a housemaster or housemistress, and then within those houses there are tutors attached to those houses, and they all take responsibility for a smaller number of pupils within that house, and they would meet with them formally twice a week, but also, of course, follow up on things affecting those pupils and dealing with things with parents. And they would also take great interest in their other involvement in the school and in things that they do in concerts and plays and sport and so on. So they would be overseeing a sort of wide area of the pupil's life. There's quite a lot more things in place, of course, beyond that. So we've got we obviously got our school counsellors, independent listeners. We have a very thriving chapel and chaplain who would do a lot of pastoral work around the school as well. So there's quite a lot there of support for pupils, and we've, as alluded to, mental health is something that's been very important to us, and we've spent quite a bit of time getting people trained as mental health first aiders, and that's another area that we're looking to try and expand and try to move to a point where we can train some of our senior pupils to be mental health champions.
And in the house, Amy, how does that work in terms of time for tutors to work with individuals?
So I suppose the tutors work very, very closely with us. They have sort of tutor sessions on a Monday afternoon, but generally speaking, the tutors are quite well-known faces around the house. They're on duty and play quite a prominent role at sort of lunch times, break times, and so on. Due to the nature of the school and with us being quite a small school community, we are like an extended family, really. So the tutors become very much a part of that, and are very much a sort of first port of call, along with myself, for any concerns, but also sort of successes and celebrations too.
Yeah, perfect. And in terms of what steer could add to what you were already doing, which I know was very strong, what was the intent of adding steer to that sort of suite of things that you do?
Well, I think that one thing that we were doing already, and most schools will be doing, of course, is academic tracking. And I think that we felt that what this appeared to offer was some sort of pastoral tracking. Now, I mentioned that tutors meet with their tutees twice a week, and and each week they also record a sort of, or make a record of issues that have come up, things that they're dealing with those tutees. So we already had in place something where they had a record of what was going on, and they could look back at things and ask how things were going and so on, and to sort of see some progress there. But I think that steer tracking was something that we felt would enable us to really see that development, and it would give us that opportunity to perhaps identify some things that weren't obvious above the surface, and then allow us a way in to try and deal with some of those things. And then the great benefit of having the twice yearly assessment then is that you can see whether there's been any change and what impact the interventions that you put in place have had. So I think that was probably the attraction of that, and the fact that and we'll probably come on to this later, I would imagine, but it did give that, or did appear, as we looked at it from the outset, to give that opportunity to perhaps see a little bit more about how pupils were thinking, feeling, and beyond what was obvious on the surface.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we can come on and look at that impact later on, I mean, just from a logistical point of view, Amy, can you just talk just a little bit about how often you assess the pupils, and how easy is it to set that up and to administer those assessments?
Yeah, so we assess the pupils twice a year. So towards the October half term, we've sort of been through our first lot of assessing, and then again in February. What that means is it allows us some time to interact with the data, essentially, and to put some action plans and follow up in place alongside our tutor teams and sort of house teams, I suppose phase groups with primary schools and things as well. It is relatively straightforward. As with anything, there's the odd technological glitch here and there, but we actually ran our assessments throughout lockdown as well, just to continue sort of that tracking program, and I think that was quite important in terms of our understanding of the impact on pupils' mental health. Obviously we had an idea anyway, but particularly for me, actually, as a house parent, there were certain pupils that the programme flagged who perhaps wouldn't otherwise have been on our radar, because they're on the surface, they are incredibly bright, together pupils, but actually the steer allowed us to flag them over lockdown through the assessment programme, and open up conversations about things that we perhaps wouldn't have otherwise touched upon.
So it was what we sometimes, isn't it, call making the invisible visible, which and again, you can only deal with what pupils make visible to you, can't you? And hopefully, therefore, that is opening up some lines of conversations with parents and pupils, I suppose. I mean, I would imagine that you looked at other well-being and well-being tools as well. What made steer stand out for you?
I think in terms of as a tool, it was quite interesting. Obviously, as Tom sort of outlined, we wanted something that supported tracking of academic data as well. Obviously, there are a plethora of different programs. Boxall profiling, I think, is one that lots of people are quite familiar with. The main sort of difference with this one is it's quite a modern way that it sort of collates logs and stores data, but also the idea that it then allows the children to take control of their own data when they come to sort of university, and look back at where they've encountered hurdles in their journey, which is actually something that we're still sort of working on at the moment, in sort of helping our sixth form to unpick that and understand their own journeys, which takes it beyond school. So, you know, it's a program that essentially we are starting to embed within the prep school and the primary school, and bringing up all the way through. So it should be something eventually that's quite well established by the time they get to their sort of university transition, and hopefully will be something that they and their parents understand, you know, how to use and how to sort of benefit from. On top of that, I think it's you know, it's sort of quite a natural accompaniment to existing practices that we already have within school. It's not something that requires lots and lots of work. You know, it should be something that complements what you're already doing. So that was also quite important for us, and I imagine quite important for other schools for whom you know, time is precious.
Absolutely. And Tom, in terms of your role as sort of deputy head, this is your 4th year of using Steer now. How did you introduce it to sort of colleagues and pupils and parents, and was that a relatively straightforward process?
Yeah, we started off really with deputy head and housemasters, housemistresses, getting to grips with how it all worked and what it involved. And we also started off with only rolling it out to 1 year group, and that, because I think with a small number of people dealing with it, you had to have a relatively small cohort starting off with it anyway. And obviously we then wrote to parents to explain what it was we were doing and what that was all about, and allowed questions to be asked. Once we'd done that, we then rolled it out to more year groups, and we've done that really on a rolling program. So we've now got it this year. We're doing it from year 5 right up to year 13. Last year we had a couple of those year groups still to come into the whole thing, but by then we had also rolled the training and so on out to tutors, so that we were bringing them into it, and that was allowing, obviously housemasters and housemistresses were overseeing that with their tutor teams, but it meant that tutors were taking much more responsibility for having a look at the data, reading it, understanding it, and then able to help in the creation of action plans. But more importantly, probably, it was informing them of exactly how they could talk to tutees and what sorts of conversations were going to help them with that. So I don't know if I've covered all the things you wanted there, but I think the point is it was a gradual rollout to more staff and to more pupils, and each year that we've launched it, whether it was to more pupils or not, we've written to parents at the start to say that what's going to be happening, because obviously there are new parents every year who don't know anything about it. So we always send out something that explains exactly what it is that's going to be happening.
And I see actually it's also on your website, isn't it? What you do, and it explains it very clearly on there, I thought, as well. And in terms of the training, how did you find the rolling out that training to a wider staff?
Yeah, I think you know, there's always the inevitable skepticism, and I think I've said to you before, Robert, but you know, I was probably one of the skeptics initially, because you know, you're as a teacher, as an educational practitioner, you know, you are confronted with lots and lots of different programs all the time, but I think, you know, we've taken quite a lot of time to speak individually to people with concerns. You know, we've done sort of use CPD to help roll it out. We've engaged with the data, so we've anonymized data and allowed staff to have a little look at some anonymous data and talk about that. We've then started training new staff, and I think the more that the language of Steer becomes a part of you know, your everyday sort of vernacular and things, it's the more staff sort of are on board with it, and also it's the seeing the impact with the students, and seeing how it flags up individuals that perhaps you wouldn't necessarily have considered previously, as you know, necessarily being on your radar, and the conversations that have then taken place, and strategies that we've then put into place speak for themselves, really. So I think, you know, on the whole, it's been quite a positive experience, but actually it's important that you have those one or two people who perhaps question it, because I mean, why wouldn't they? You know, it's a natural part of the process, and I think you know, it for me particularly, the more we've used it, the more the program sort of speaks for itself, essentially.
And I think you touched on there that use of language, and I think that is quite a key thing, isn't it? To give staff a language and an understanding of some of the issues that might be lying behind the things that they're seeing, and a way of being able to explain that and understand that. I think is quite important. And have you? I mean, it sounds from what you say as if you have, but have you found that actually staff are beginning to have that language, and that's sort of becoming inculcated within the staff itself?
Yeah, absolutely. I think particularly for house parents now, it's very much ingrained in conversations that we've sort of had, but also, you know, it's beginning to get there with tutors as well. I think the next step that we're sort of moving towards, albeit it's been quite a busy term this term, but we want to start hosting drop-in sessions for staff, so that within houses, and we can then, Tom and I can discuss specific pupils within those houses, and sort of strategies and interventions that are being put in place, just to allow staff to have that confidence before they go into those discussions themselves, which I think will be quite beneficial both for them and for us, just so that we have a wider overview of what's going on in the cohort, but so that they also feel that they've got the sort of ingredients and things to go into those discussions with.
I think it might be worth just adding that I've felt that probably, and you know, for people who are thinking of doing this in their own schools, it might be worth just considering that I felt that, looking back at the way we did it, I think I might have wanted to present the whole idea to all staff earlier, even if they weren't immediately all going to be involved in it, because I think that you naturally get a number of people who are enthusiastic about a new initiative like this, who would immediately want to come on board and act as champions for it in the school. And I think that it would have given people a little bit longer to get accustomed to it. So it's probably worth other people thinking about maybe doing that. Whereas I think we probably kept a little bit too tight to begin with just deputy head, housemasters, housemistresses, and tutors not really having an involvement perhaps early enough. So.
No, thank you. That is helpful, and I mean it's interesting. I mean, you will always get the skeptics and the slightly more cynical people, and I freely admit I was one when I first sort of saw about it and was first introduced to it, and now look at me. I mean, what was your sort of eureka moment that sort of took you over the divide, as it were, into someone who was being slightly skeptical to someone thinking, actually, this can really work for us?
Well, I mean, I always sort of think of one particular individual story, really, where about 3 years ago we had a boy in a boarding house in the sixth form. He was obviously quite a low discloser. You could tell that about him. He was quite independent. He didn't need to say much to the staff about anything, and you'd have a conversation and ask him how things were going, and he would say yes, everything's okay. There wasn't much to say. Anything that he was going to go into any detail about would be relatively mundane. And you might have felt that, and all that. I think we knew that he had a slightly difficult home background, but we didn't know a great deal more than that. And I don't think that without steer tracking we would have got very much further with him in terms of that situation. But what steer tracking revealed was that there were quite a lot of polar biases in a number of areas, and that there was hidden vulnerability, and that what that really enabled the housemaster to do in this particular situation was to get alongside him and ask questions, have conversations, with a lot of help from what the resources that go with steer tracking showed. And eventually there was a sort of moment where all the problems poured out, and we were then able to do quite a lot more to help this particular individual. And it was then a real success story from then on. And he needed the support that he'd not been wanting to ask for. I don't think we would have ever had that moment without steer tracking. So I think that's a good example, and they're not always dramatic as that, of course, but that illustrates it for me, and certainly is one that has made me think, if I had any skepticism about it, it would have disappeared with that.
And I think that sort of nails it, doesn't it, really? Because the data, as you had just alluded to, the data is just the start, isn't it? It's then what you do with the data and the support that you provide groups or individuals in this case, and then are you able then to see that development and that impact? And I think that's important. How about you, Amy? What was your eureka moment?
I think so. For me, there was I had a girl who had just moved into my house, and she had very, very low, I mean, it may have just gone with the program, in terms of her seeking change was very, very low. Her self-disclosure was very, very low, and her trust of others was very, very low. Her trust of self was high, which is sometimes they go hand in hand, I think. But she obviously, as a new pupil, was on my radar anyway. However, with that sort of data in mind, some of the discussions that then came from that were sort of based on that data, and it transpired that she'd actually had a couple of sort of quite significant shifts in her family life that had happened. Her brother had gone off to the Navy, and so on and so forth, and some of the dialogue and the patterns that came from that allowed me to really sort of develop a relationship with her, where she had been quite closed off to one previously, and I think her data from there on in after that was far more sort of normalized and level, and whether that would have happened anyway, I don't know, but it certainly gave me the sort of confidence to keep going with those conversations and keep plowing through. And she's somebody who's a very, very happy young lady at school these days, and I think it certainly steer certainly factored into that. So yeah, I was grateful for that sort of input, I think.
I think it's those personal stories, isn't it, that really resonate, and that make you understand the difference that you can make. We've looked a little bit at sort of the intent, and we've looked a little bit at the implementation. Just in terms of impact, what do you think have been the main impacts for your pupils? I mean, we've alluded to it a little bit anyway, but what do you think have been the main impacts for the pupils?
So I think consistency of approach, having a platform that all of our staff are using, that we're making sure that we're implementing into our practice, and that pupils and parents recognise as being a part of the school sort of pastoral programme. Greater dialogue, so the conversations that come through steer, and the tutors being able to have the confidence, even if they don't necessarily feel as familiar or confident with their tutees as other members of staff, perhaps, and probably more tailored support. So particularly for those pupils, perhaps, who, it sounds like a horrible phrase actually, but I would hope they wouldn't, but those pupils who maybe slightly more sort of quiet and fall through the gaps, so to speak, usually, I think the support that it provides for them is invaluable.
And it's interesting. I mean, Tom, when I was interviewed for my deputy headship, one of the questions I was asked there was, how can you ensure a basic level of tutoring across the school, which I thought was quite an interesting question. in some ways, has AS tracking sort of helped you to do that a little bit?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It is one of the things in schools, is every member of staff is a tutor, and obviously with that you're going to get a variety in the quality of tutoring and what happens in tutor meetings. But certainly having some sort of platform like this with some clear guidelines and some clear advice and things for tutors, I think is really helpful. And certainly, yeah, that is very much something that helps to bring that consistency, because everybody's following the same kind of line on a number of these issues. So, yeah, I agree.
And in terms of other impacts for staff, what have you seen as other than that sort of consistency? What have been the other benefits and the impacts on staff that you've seen?
I think for senior staff, perhaps, like or for people like me, and probably also for housemasters, housemistresses, having an overview of a set of data has been really useful. And in terms of understanding how different year groups are responding, and the school as a whole has dealt with the challenges of going away from school for lockdowns, coming back and restarting after a long period away, and so on. We've been able to look at that data as a whole set, as well as the individual things. I think that's been really useful. And then in terms of tutors who perhaps are looking more at that individual level, I think it's just focused their minds more on a lot of the pastoral issues that are affecting our pupils at the moment, and it's given them another way of looking at it, and probably just greater awareness of pastoral care, because as we've sort of alluded to already, it comes naturally to some staff and less naturally to others. But I think this has very much been something that's helped to focus their minds on what some of the key things are, and to understand that actually you can make an enormous difference to them, but with the conversations that you have, and particularly with a bit of guidance around those.
And actually, in terms of those conversations, and you mentioned the pandemic, and I think that in some ways the pandemic has given an opportunity to work more closely, hasn't it, with parents. How has Steer, do you think, helped in terms of the targeting and in terms of your strategic conversations with those parents?
I think for me, starting to introduce the language with parents again has been really important in some cases, and has actually led to there's been a couple of situations where perhaps there's a little bit of attachment with a couple of my pupils, and obviously that's something that needs to be dealt with quite sensitively. And it's actually allowed me to have that open discussion with the parents, and they've sort of got there of their own accord, and said, perhaps I'm sort of factoring into this a little bit. How could I go about this? And it's in that regard, it's been really useful, because it may have been something that we wouldn't otherwise have got to discuss, I suppose, in that aspect. And they've actually taken quite a large interest in the programme and what's going on with their child, but have then actively stepped away and taken a step back, which is positive. So
that's good. And again, I know we're slightly running short of time, but is an interesting question, and I hope it's not sort of too coarse a question to ask. But I mean, it is a significant investment, isn't it? Steer is a significant investment for a school, both in time and cost. Would your school governors say it's delivered?
Yeah, I mean, I'm the one that ends up reporting to the governors on what we're doing, and I'm certainly giving them a lot of the sort of information that we've already gone through in this webinar, and then the one or two of those individual stories that illustrate that. I think that they certainly do think that it has been worth investing in. I think it's been, from their point of view, they will obviously understand that the things that I'm saying to them about what impact it's had on pupils. I think they recognise also that it's a very clear indication to parents that this is an area that pastoral care is an area we're taking very seriously, and that we're looking at other angles into it. And this is, as we've always said with steer, it's it doesn't take over all the other bits of pastoral care, it doesn't replace them, but it certainly provides another dimension which wasn't there before. And I think that the governors see that and recognise that that parents will value it.
And just sort of lastly, really, I mean, and you mentioned there impact, which obviously is critical, isn't it, to be able to see the impact, not just on steer action plans, but just other things that you're doing in the school, and to be able to see the impact of that on your pupils in school is very important. How have you used the action planning tools? Has it been more on an individual level? Has it been more on a sort of cohort or group level, or indeed both?
We've done a little bit of both, actually, and I think particularly for Tom and I, it's been really quite invaluable as a cohort action plan, and that's where I think probably more for leadership in schools, the cohort action plan comes into play, because you can look at those trends, as Tom mentioned earlier, and actually what was helpful for us was to see whether we were in line with national trends, or whether that it was something that was specific to St Lawrence. So for us in particular, self-disclosure, I think we've spoken about this before, Robert, but self-disclosure in girls dropped quite considerably, which was interesting for us. So we made that a point of focus in one of our school action plans, but also obviously for me as a house parent and for my tutors, we look at the individual action plans within our house, and in relation to that, obviously the hard work initially is establishing that action plan, choosing things to focus on with that individual, but the program then allows you to monitor it, so you don't necessarily have to keep inputting something different. It could be that you're just going back in and saying, well, this is on our radar, this is what we're doing to support it. So it doesn't have to be incredibly paperwork heavy and time consuming. It can just be that you're sort of dropping in to say, well, have we reviewed this? How have we implemented this?
And those plans are very sort of intentional, aren't they? They're very strategic and very targeted at specific individuals. And I think, as you say, and to be able to see that impact at the end is critical. Trevor, I'm just going to bring Trevor in, who's been lurking in the background to see if we've had any questions. Thank you, Trevor. Any questions that have come in? Trevor also works at Steer. Trevor, have we had any questions while we've been chatting?
No, well, we haven't, and I think that's probably a reflection on how comprehensive Amy and Tom's answers been, and through the structure. I think they've covered all areas of the school and how they're making the very best use of Steer as an accredited school. So thank you to both of you and to Robert, of course, for leading the interview. But from my side, just quietly listening in the background, it was just an excellent account of how Steer can be used to support the young people in schools. So made me very proud to listen to your comments as we went through. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Tom and Amy, and I hope you have a great end of term, and all the very best wishes to you, Amy, particularly. I hope all goes well, and thank you again for your time this morning, and to everyone who has joined us or who will listen on the recording, and thank you also to Fiona for organising all of it. But thank you very much, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.